Going. Perfect. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome back to night 4 of our Faith and Civility series. It's been a great series. We've heard from a number of different voices, and we're joined by our governor tonight. I'm going to introduce him in just a minute, but I'm glad you're here. I want to welcome Woodmont members. I want to welcome those that are on the live stream, as well as other friends from the community that have come to hear Governor Lee tonight. Would you join me and say a short prayer as we begin, and then we'll start. Loving God, we are grateful once again to come to the church midweek, to be together in fellowship and to talk about faith and civility and leadership in the public square. Tonight, the folks of Florida are on our minds as the hurricane makes landfall. We pray for them and pray for all the folks that are going to be helping with rescue and relief and recovery. We lift them up. We're also thankful for the leadership of our governor, and we pray for Maria tonight as we are gathered here. Be with us tonight, and thank you for the chance to come together to talk and to be in dialogue. All this we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so welcome. This is the fourth night. We started off with Dean John Gear from Vanderbilt University. The second week, we had Professor Samar Ali, who is one of the co-chairs of the Project on Unity and American Democracy with John Meacham and Bill Haslam at Vanderbilt. Then the third week, last week, we heard from David French. And tonight, we are joined by the 50th governor of the state of Tennessee. He's a 7th generation Tennessean, was a businessman before he ran for governor, and I'm going to ask him about that. But would you join me in welcoming Governor Bill Lee here tonight?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So, Governor, thank you for being here. A lot of us were, very surprised about a month ago when we heard the news about Maria, that she was diagnosed with lymphoma. So I wanted to start by just asking you how she's doing and just express our concern for her.
Yeah. It's been a very interesting month for sure for us. We've realized, for one thing, that there are thousands and millions of people that go through the very difficult emotions and the things that we're going through right now. So it's not lost on us that we are not the only ones doing this, but the outreach from people has been enormous and significant, and we're very, very grateful for people's prayers and for their words of encouragement to us. Maria's doing well. She's fighting a good fight. She is, for those of you who have either been through cancer or known someone who's been through it, there's a lot of different kinds of cancers, a lot of different kinds of treatment, but she is in treatment with chemotherapy, and that is a challenge, but we're very hopeful, and we see a path to healing, and we trust God for that, and we have really great doctors who are his tools for that. So thank you for asking about her.
Please.
She wishes she could be here.
Give her our best, and we will continue to pray for her and for you as you move forward with that.
Thank you.
Something that a lot of people here may not know is you grew up at Woodmont Christian Church. This was where you spent your childhood. Your father, Wallace Lee, chaired the board here way back in the day, I believe, when Claire Berry was the pastor. Your aunt and uncle, Ted Sondra, are here tonight, and I know they're proud of you and glad to be here. But can you just talk about some of the memories you have of growing up at Woodmont? It's changed a lot. It looks a lot different.
Kind of looking up there at that bay window and that house up there where we had youth group. So my family came here from the time I'm not sure if we came here when I was born, but I think so. And I came to church here throughout my childhood and through college and into my 20s. And Dr. Derwoda was the senior pastor when I was a child. And I still remember that man's accent and his wisdom, and he had a profound impact on me. Dr. Berry, his family they had children, the Berrys did, that aligned with the ages of my family. And we were very good personal friends. I've remained friends with theirs. As you know, Dr. Berry passed away just a couple of months ago, and I am in communication. I visited them out in California, so he too, probably as much as anyone, shaped my faith, and my understanding of it certainly changed as I grew older and matured in my understanding of what it was to be a Christian. But he had an enormous impact on me. This whole church has. It's part of the reason I was delighted to be back here and to come back here. I have great memories, but also have the realization that I was shaped in significant ways by the people in this church and the leadership as well.
Any particular memories? You know, we still do outreach up here. We're about to be in the process of deciding if we can renovate that beautiful house or if it will have to ultimately be bulldozed in one day. But we do outreach in that, what was the old youth group house and Room in the Inn. The Nashville Food Project, as many of you know, was actually birthed up there before it moved over into the nations. But any particular memories that you have from growing up, being in the youth group?
So we had live nativity at Woodmont, and our family has cattle. So we would bring the live cattle to the event. We thought that was so great that we could participate in that. They had a youth service, and I still have the program where I wasn't the only preacher, but I think there were 2 or 3 of us that were chosen to give the message, and I'll never forget that. I probably prepared for that more than anything I'd ever done in my life. I was nervous as I could be to stand up in front of a sanctuary of adults and deliver, I'm sure it was a very moving message.
I'm sure it was great.
I can only imagine what that was like as a 16-year-old, but I have great memories.
Well, and you were here with Walk Through Bethlehem, which is now a massive ministry that's been off for 2 years because of the pandemic. Started at South Hall. It started with a youth group. It started as a live nativity scene. And over time, it's grown and grown. And now we welcome that second, Sunday in December. Thousands of people walk through our church. We always fight about how many people it really is, and I say thousands of people walk through our church.
Might as well say it.
And it's an amazing outreach, and it goes way back. I'm going to have a conversation with Governor Lee. If you have questions, there are note cards in the back, and you can write those down. And Jay Hutchins is going to help me collect those, and we'll have a short time for Q&A at the end. But let me begin by asking you this. So you were a businessman. You went to Auburn, grew up here in Nashville, Franklin. You worked in your company business, a Lee Company, for many years. I think your grandfather, I believe, started Lee Company. What was it that made you decide to run for governor of the state of Tennessee?
I was a businessman in part because of that man right there, my uncle, who, along with my father, ran that company through the 60s and 70s and 80s, and when I came to work there, and I'm very grateful for his mentorship and leadership in my life and how he sewed into my understanding of what it meant to run a family business. People often ask me how I made that decision to run. You have events in your life that change your perspective on the purpose of your life and what you're going to do with it. My first wife was killed when I was 40. I had 4 little kids, and it was a traumatic experience, of course. It sort of just turned my whole life upside down. But in the way that God does, in redemptive fashion, he often takes the most difficult things in our life and he uses them for good. And I often say that was the most tragic but transformational season of my life. It caused me to evaluate my life. It certainly clears the field and makes you think through what matters and what doesn't. I loved my business and I loved the people there, and that was very much that was a lot of the purpose of my life. But I also got more engaged because of this evaluation of things that really mattered. I got more engaged in nonprofit work. I wanted my kids to experience things outside of their life. We went to Africa and we went to Haiti. We went to Mexico, built homes for impoverished, and worked in refugee camps and worked in orphanages, and mostly we didn't do anything so much for them as what they did for us to remind you of the things that matter. But that engagement also challenged me to become more engaged with things at home and nonprofits at home. And I got involved in a prison ministry, mentoring men coming out of prison. I met a guy who started this ministry called Men of Valor some 25 years ago, and that was intriguing to me, and they had a mentorship program. And so I started mentoring men that were, first of all, I started meeting men in prison, which was a profound experience. Again, I thought I was doing something for them, but they were really doing something for me. And that led to a real interest in criminal justice issues and criminal justice, mostly reentry. Really, it was about reentry for me. The fact that everyone in prison is going to get out. Not everyone, but the vast majority, 95% of the people sitting in a jail cell will get out. And what we do with people when they are about to get out and when they do reenter profoundly impacts not only their life, but the recidivism rate and the crime rate. And so I got really interested in that, talked to Governor Haslam about it. He appointed me to a task force on recidivism and sentencing reform. And that started a real interest in interaction with state government on the issue of correction and the justice system. I was interested in that. I had a couple other experiences too. Lee Barfield's in the audience. And we worked together years before I became governor on some business-related issues that were legislative, tort reform. But I worked in the inner city through the YMCA, which I ended up chairing the Y, but I worked in the Y with an organization called YCAP, which dealt with really at-risk youth. And I enjoyed that work. I ended up, through that program, deciding to mentor a young man that was 13. His mom was in prison. He didn't know his father, didn't know who his father was. He lived in a very tough neighborhood. He was failing every subject in his school. I decided to drive into his neighborhood. I told my wife, and I had one daughter left at home, and I said, I'm going to mentor this kid. And I drove into his neighborhood once a week, every week, for 5 years, and picked him up and took him out to eat and talked about life. And again, that young man changed my life. And I got very interested in his education and the challenges of the inner city youth and education, got interested in education reform. Governor Haslam appointed me to the Higher Education Commission when I talked to him about that. And once again, I started having interaction with state government around the issues of education. Somewhere along the line of those interactions with state government, I realized that maybe my life could have a bigger impact in these areas that I was particularly passionate about if I became more engaged. And ultimately, if I thought, you know what, wonder if it's possible for a person like me to run for governor, to appoint commissioners, to work on criminal justice reform, to work on education reform, to work on things that I thought would be impactful to changing people's lives. And I was married to Maria, and we talked a lot about that. We prayed about it for a year, and I felt compelled to give it a shot. I didn't have a lot to lose other than an election, and for me that was okay if that happened. And most people thought I probably would lose that election, so it didn't deter me. But I ran and won, and I gotta say, we could talk a lot about this job and the good and bad of it, but the ability to then engage in the Success in Reentry Act, to have that passed, or the Alternatives to Incarceration Act, or the education savings account bill that, in my view, is an opportunity for especially low-income students in our biggest cities to have access to another option for education, to be able to impact those areas that I found myself passionate about has been an incredible honor. It's been the highest honor of my life, frankly.
So you recently went to Memphis. Memphis is my hometown. I've been in Nashville now for 15 years, but I grew up, born and raised in Memphis. And we had the Eliza Fletcher situation there that was just so awful and tragic. And then just a couple of days later, there's another situation on Wednesday night where somebody's driving around and filming what they're doing. So while you're speaking of criminal justice reform, and how do you begin to process these situations? You obviously go and you see the families and you see the aftermath of what happens, but as a society, whether it's Memphis, Nashville, East Tennessee, how do we think about these things, and how do we process them, and how do we, in the one situation, I know that somebody had pushed for a little bit of leniency because the person was so young the first time they committed a crime.
These are really hard. When I did a press conference in Memphis, and I said, unfortunately, Memphis has seen evil at work, and there's no doubt that that's what occurred there. I personal friends with the family of Eliza Fletcher and with some members of her family, and those are really difficult. Painful, difficult human tragedies that policy impacts, and I think we have to address violent crime. Violent crime is on the rise in this country. It needs to be addressed. It's very difficult to know exactly how to address that. There are some very clear ways that we can and we have, and part of that is supporting law enforcement. So we put 100 new troopers in our budget this year. We put $100 million in a violent crime intervention grant fund that goes to sheriff's departments and police departments around the country. I've met with district attorneys about how it is that we can improve the system and the way that works. I met with the DA conference leaders, and we have to be really tough, in my view, on violent crime, but we have to be really smart too about the way that we do it. And there are not easy answers, but there are clear, what we would call proven crime prevention strategies that we are engaging in as a community and as a state. And I will say too, I think that we have an enormous flow of illegal drug traffic into our country that is oftentimes the backdrop to violent crime. The connection between organized crime, gang activity, and drug traffic, that connection between that and the violence that we see on our streets is clear, and recognizing that and addressing some of the root causes are a part of a very complicated issue that the entirety of America is facing right now, and we are taking some definitive steps to address it.
This series, we've talked a lot about faith and civility, and specifically what role does faith and morality play in the life of public servants. And so this is always a challenge in a nation that has the separation of church and state. I've always said there's a separation of church and state. There's not necessarily a separation of faith and politics, no matter who you are or what your political slant might be. Your faith and your values should inform your policies. What role do you see faith? What role does faith play in your life and how you govern? What role should faith play in the life of our public servants?
I'm not sure that it is a question of whether it should play a role. It either does or it doesn't in a person's life. My faith in Christ is the most important thing in my life personally. It is a very important part of who I am as a person and how I view the world, how I view my own life. regular citizens have a worldview. I say regular citizens versus public servants, but people that are just everyday, regular, anyone, every human being has a worldview, and it is shaped, if they're a person of faith, regardless of their faith, whatever that faith is, it is shaped. If it's genuine faith, then it shapes their worldview, and it shapes their convictions and their beliefs. And so you can't separate that from politics, because politics is made up of people, and those people have, including myself, they have a worldview and convictions based on that faith. So I don't think it should play a role necessarily, but if a person is a person of faith, then it does play a role in the way they think about policy or decisions that they make, and it certainly has in my life. My faith informs me that I should love my God with all my heart, but I should love my neighbor as myself. And I don't always do that correctly. None of us do. But if our policy is based on that belief that we should be loving our neighbors and recognizing the dignity of a human being, every human being, then in my view, that's an important part of how we think about the policy that we advocate for or the positions that we take on a particular issue. I try to remind myself of the commandment to love and the obligation to see every single person, whether I agree with them or they agree with me, or as having shared humanity, and the dignity of that human being should be the underpinning of policy, in my view, especially for people of faith.
So you would consider yourself an evangelical Christian in terms of you share your faith, you don't hide it. There's been, as you know, in recent years, there's been a lot of criticism, broad criticism of evangelical Christianity as being too political or too partisan, meaning too focused on one party. And one of the premises for this series was, well, if Christians have been part of the polarization and part of the divide, then shouldn't Christians and people of faith also be part of the solution, where we come together to listen? But there has been a lot of criticism of evangelical Christianity, and I know you've heard it. And what do you make of that?
I think one of the disappointing things for me in the role that I've found myself in, I'm certainly disappointed in myself at the times that I fail in this way, but one of my disappointments has actually been the way people of faith exhibit their faith in their walk in politics. There is so much divisiveness and demonization of people who don't agree with you. And if that person happens to be an evangelical Christian who may not be embodying the qualities that Scripture has laid out for us to walk in, then it's easy to be critical of that. And we should be. When you think about what a Christian should, and at least what we're called to walk in, when you think about the way we should walk, I'm reminded of the fruits of the Spirit, right? If we're walking in whatever you're walking in, however, in your work, in your family, in your interactions with other people, and whether you're in politics, public service, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, self-control. I have those printed out, and I have them to remind myself when I'm not walking in those things. But when you look at the political world and the way social media, the news, the interactions, the folks that are talking, so often, if you held that up as a standard by which we communicate and treat other people, we fail. And we fail. We're humans, we fail, but we should hold that up as a standard. I try to hold that up as a standard. I fail. Like, a disclaimer is I'm not an expert on civility, and I'm not an expert on walking in the fruits of the Spirit. But I do believe that that's a standard that we ought to hold up as a way to walk. I think oftentimes this incivility and the toxic environment in politics and the what we see that we don't like about politics is often the result of sort of dehumanizing the opponent. I talked a little bit about the shared humanity that we all have. It's very easy when your opponent is on social media or on the news channel or someone across the way that is firing away at you. It's very easy to dehumanize and to demonize, in some respects, your ideological opponents because you don't know them, you're not looking at them face to face, you're not, you know, if you had ideological differences with your neighbor and you know, or somebody that you, I don't know, watch football with, or your kids go to school together, or you have a human face to attach to that ideological difference, it's so much easier to agree to disagree than if you relinquish to the dehumanization of that person and the ease of demonization of that person.
That's a theme. By the way, this is a shameless plug, but the next sermon series at Woodmont is on the fruits of the Spirit after we get through the parables.
Oh, good.
I didn't set you up for that, but
maybe I'll come
we get through the parables in Luke.
I'll probably learn a thing or two.
Yeah, so I'll send you those, Governor, if you want me to, but I still have to write them.
I'm not sure I got them all right there. You can tell me if I got
it was
them
great.
right.
But I guess this theme has come up pretty much every week of this series, and that is we live in this age. It's a digital age. It's a social media age. It's a big billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar cable news business that almost wants to keep us divided, keep us angry, and then you throw in 2 years of COVID, where we were even more isolated and lonely and fractured than usual, and the dehumanization reached all-time highs. And one of my theories during COVID is that, you know, a lot of churches were closed for a while and didn't worship, and a lot of people just started worshiping politics, and that became their God, left, right, whatever. And so I think the question is, you know, why it seems like we moved from an age, and maybe I'm kidding myself, where people used to say, you know, I totally disagree with you, but I know that you're a good father, you're a good husband, you're a good member of the community. And now we live in this age where more times than not, it seems like if I disagree with you, not only do I have to say why I disagree with you, but I have to discredit you. And I have to show why you're a flawed messenger. And so one of my questions is, how do we get back to a place where we can engage the conversation on a host of issues, and there's so many of them, and not demonize the person, but say, I hear you, and I see it differently, but I still care about you. And you answered it, a relationship is a common bond. But how else can we get back to a time where we don't demonize people and we actually talk about the issues intelligently?
I think a lot of times because I certainly find myself in a position today where, you know, there are there are people that I don't agree with, and they don't agree with me, and we have ideological differences. I think there's oftentimes a conflation between the idea that we should maybe not uphold our convictions in order to find civility, but I really think there is an ability for civility without ever losing your convictions, and it comes when you try to understand someone else's conviction. You know, if you believe a certain way on a very politically divisive subject, that like abortion is a perfect example. If you believe one way on that issue, it's likely that you have very strong conviction about that, and that you may be uncompromising in your conviction because it's passionate for you, it's important to you. But if you can stop, and I try to do this, stop and think about the conviction of the person who believes differently than I do, and that their passion and their purpose on that issue is as important as my passion and my purpose. Understanding their conviction can allow me to treat them with civility, even though we have a wide difference of opinion over a very emotionally divisive subject. I think we can do that, but you have to be willing to, and honestly, I think a whole lot of it has to do with just how we treat people, regardless of what they think or what their viewpoint is on something. How we treat them, what we say about them, not what we say about the position or the policy, because we can be very clear about what we think. You know, I've thought often about the ministry, Jesus' ministry. You know, he never watered down his message. And he never veered from the truth in which he embodied. But he never wavered on how he treated other people, regardless of whether they followed him or not. And he certainly was clear with those who were in opposition to him, but I think he also understood that people who disagreed with him oftentimes came from a place of personal pain. The woman in the well, for example, or the tax collector, and that may not have been a personal pain issue, but understanding that while they might not come from the same ideological view that he came from, that the humanity of that person was what was most important to him. And he did not compromise in his conviction, but I think he recognized their humanity, and he never wavered from the way he treated people. And it actually disarmed and shocked most of the people that interacted with him. They had preconceived ideas. If you read scripture and look at the stories, they had ideas of what it would be like, and he threw them off because of his ability to treat them with humanity in the midst of the disagreements that he had with them. I don't always do that, certainly, but I think a lot about what it must have been like to be him and face vehement and violent opposition, so much so that he was actually murdered. And yet watch the way he interacted with people, never compromised his conviction or what he knew to be truth, but continued on that path of walking in the fruit of the Spirit.
Well, you might remember from your growing up years in the Christian church that we have a lot of sayings that we go back to: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; but in all things, love or charity. We say unity is our polar star. Go back to the quote of the Bible that we're called to speak the truth in love. Sometimes we forget the in love part. We want to speak the truth, but we forget about the way that we do that really matters. And I've always told folks here, I don't want you to give up your beliefs and your perspectives and your opinions and your convictions at all. We try to be what we call a purple church. We've got Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives, but you gotta be willing to listen to somebody else. And you can't think that your way is the only way. And so what happens is, I was talking Sunday about humility, and we live in this culture where everybody feels like they have to be right. And you can't always be right. Human beings are not always right, and nobody wants to be around somebody who's always right. But the way that we have the conversation is really important.
And agreeing, and really agreeing to disagree, and understanding that you and I don't see the world the same, and not expecting people to see the world the same way that you do. And the real challenge comes in seeing someone's belief or their stand on an issue or their approach to policy and not making it a reflection of who they are rather than what they think. Those are really two different things. And if we see people for who they are and not for what they think about an issue, we can be civil. You know, we won't agree, and people get very passionate and very emotional about the disagreements, and they could and should, but incivility occurs when we quit seeing that person as a valuable human being and we see them for what they think or what position they hold.
Your two immediate predecessors, Governor Bill Haslam, Republican, Governor Phil Bredesen, Democrat, have launched this new podcast. They're actually on national TV this past weekend talking about it. And it's based on Howard Baker's famous line, "Don't forget the other guy might be right." And they're trying to model this. I think they both believe that we've really reached beyond a boiling point in our polarization and our incivility. And so we've got to come together and talk about things like they've talked about climate, they've talked about guns, they've talked about a lot of things where people have strong convictions and they're deeply divided. And I applaud them, for doing that. I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to that or, to be in touch with them. I thought your book was great, This Road That I'm On. I thought Governor Haslam's book on faithful presence was a really good book. But any thoughts on what your predecessors are doing? Because they clearly see this as a challenge in the country, and they want to help be part of the solution.
Yeah, and I think it's they certainly have a perspective that I don't even have yet, and that many of us don't have, and that is one who has served in this role and then left the role and can look at it from an outside perspective, and that wisdom is incredibly valuable in the conversation going forward. I actually had them and their wives both together at dinner, along with Governor Dunn and his wife, and Governor Sundquist and his wife. And we had just a great conversation about, really not entirely about this subject, but just about how difficult it is to be, people who care, who got into this because they cared about people and because they cared about making life better for people. And when you get to know people that have walked in that same path that you're currently walking in right now, it was incredibly valuable for me to say, how did you do this, and what was that like, and how did you deal with with issues like this? Those are both men who certainly didn't need the job and who walked into that position because they cared about their state and they cared about their people and they cared about serving others, and they're a great example for us, all of us, going forward.
Let me ask you a couple of questions. You're a cattle farmer. You have a farm.
Not so much anymore.
Maybe you don't have time to cattle farm right now.
I would like to be. I go home on the weekends and I get to do a little of it, but not as much as I used to.
One of the things that people have said is that in our country right now, and I'd be curious if you see this in Tennessee, is that there seems to be a divide between rural and urban communities. So Nashville's always been called a blue city and a red state. There's been books written. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who passed away, said that we got this gap between what he calls the somewheres and the anywheres. The somewheres are the people that are in middle America who feel left behind by the new economy, the digital economy, and the anywheres can live on the coasts and they're doing just fine. Do you see the urban-rural divide? And do you talk to people in Tennessee who feel like, I can't, doesn't matter what I do, the way that I used to make a living or the way that I have my livelihood is no longer adequate, and I feel ignored?
Talk a little bit about political divide, but I think there's clearly an economical divide between rural and urban centers across the country. We were looking at a slide today about the decline of population in rural Tennessee counties versus urban counties, and we've actually slowed that decline down, and we may be turning it around. Part of what I hope in Tennessee is that our focus on rural communities is actually starting to take hold. So when I came into office, actually the first EO, executive order I wrote, required every department of state government to provide a strategic plan on how they were going to positively impact our rural counties, in particular what we call our distressed counties. Those are counties that fall in the bottom 10% of poverty in America. We had 15 of them when I came into office. And so we put a real focus and an emphasis on how to improve life, particularly economically in rural communities, because it strengthens our whole state when we do that. We went from 15 to 10 in 4 years. I hope that we can go to 0 in the next few years. But part of the way you do it, you talked about the digital divide. So we put $500 million in broadband expansion. And we announced hundreds of millions of dollars of those grants even just this week. When people can access technology, it allows them to work from home. It allows them to access healthcare in new ways from home. It allows them to access educational opportunities from home, even if their home is Clay County in rural Appalachia. And so there is a real divide between opportunity in rural communities and those in urban centers. Part of what is so great about Ford making the decision to move to Tennessee, and we are very fortunate in our state. We have companies coming here from all over the country, and there are a lot of reasons for that, but Ford made their decision to build the first plant they built in 50 years in Tennessee, and they put it in Haywood County, which is one of the poorest, one of the most economically challenged areas, at least, of our state, which is rural West Tennessee. That'll have a real impact on a bunch of rural counties. It's going to be 30,000 jobs in that region. 6,000 associated with the plant itself, but then another 25,000 or so jobs that'll be created outside of that. That's opportunity, and it's economic opportunity, and it changes the future for that section of our state, for the people that live in our state. Haywood County is the only rural, predominantly African-American county in Tennessee, so that's important too, because we should, I was in New York this week, Monday and Tuesday, and we were making a presentation to S&P and to the bond rating agencies. And we talked about our state and our fiscal position in the country, and we're in a very good spot right now in Tennessee. We have the fastest growing economy of any state in America, of all states. And we have the lowest tax per capita in the country, the lowest debt per capita in the country. Economically, we're in a very good spot. But what I said to the folks there was, we can talk about debt and taxes and economies, but at the end of the day, it's really about people. And if these policies are not actually and they do, when you have economic activity, you provide opportunity. It provides opportunity. The government doesn't provide opportunity. The people do through the economic activity. But we shouldn't stop there. We should look at, I mentioned the African-American county of Haywood. We should be looking for the hardest places for economic opportunity. The people with the greatest barriers, the people with the greatest challenges. That's why rural Tennessee does matter, because that's where poverty exists frequently, in the inner city and in our rural communities. When we look at not just what helps most of the people, but then take the next step and drill down on the ones that are least likely to access that opportunity, then I think we will have done our job right.
Public education is really important to you and has been. It was one of the reasons that you wanted to run for governor. I know you support charter schools, and you believe that's been a great opportunity. I know that you advocated for raises for our teachers in the last budget. Can you just say a word about public education, why you're passionate about it? I know we got teachers here tonight. We got a partner school, Fall Hamilton Elementary, that Woodmont partners with, and we try to give them resources and support and be reading buddies and lunch buddies. Why are you passionate about public education? Why? I find that everybody is on board with, we want public education to be better. Everybody's not on board with how do we do that, right? And so, just say a few words. I know that's a big, big area, but I know it's something.
First of all, thank you, Woodmont Church, for partnering with the school. Whenever we have the community engaged in things that are important to our society, that's really how it works. I mean, government's not the answer to the greatest challenges we face. It requires the people to engage, so your engagement in public education is important. The future of Tennessee lies in the next generation of people. It lies in the children that are in our schools today. The vast majority of our kids are educated in public schools. If we don't engage, and if we don't invest in, and if we don't take seriously public education, then we are not taking seriously the education the way it should today. So
in 1992, put it in perspective.
So we changed the funding formula so that we wouldn't just put more money into public schools, but that we would wisely invest money in public schools. One of the things that funding formula does, you mentioned pay raises. So we've given teacher pay raises every year that I've come in here. Teaching is a calling. My wife is a teacher. I recognize that teachers do not do it just for the pay, certainly don't, because the pay it's not the highest pay in the world, and we know that. That's why we've advocated for teacher pay raises every year. But the funding formula actually fixes a loophole that kept teachers from getting pay raises that were appropriated through the legislature. And without getting into all the details of that, teacher pay raises are important. Teachers, we also, I'm really proud of this, we also have the first of its kind and the only federally recognized teacher apprenticeship program to grow teachers and to grow the pipeline of teachers and to incentivize more of our best and brightest students to engage in the profession of teaching. But you talked about charter schools. I will say that, my children were homeschooled, private schooled, public schooled. The kid that I mentored went to a charter school. It's not that I'm a believer in one kind of school or another. Certainly our public schools are the driver and they need the focus of our attention. But I also believe that the more choices that people have for educational opportunity, the better off all of our schools will be. Whenever a child has an option and a choice, whenever, frankly, a parent or a family or a caregiver has the ability to choose the school that their child goes to, I think that we elevate the entire education system, including our public schools. So I'm a strong believer and supporter of our public school systems and of the ability for people to choose the path that they think is best for their child's education.
You took a lot of flack. I'm going to ask you a couple more, then let Jay, if you have a question you'd like to write down for the governor, please go ahead, and Jay's going to walk around. But you took a lot of flack a month or 5 weeks ago over something that you did not say. And a lot of people accused you of siding with it. I've known you a long time, since before you were governor. I knew you and you're a businessman. And there's no doubt in my mind that you support teachers, that you believe in teachers. And so this is more of a Clay question. Sometimes in public office, people are not given a fair shake because they don't respond to something or because they don't address it. But I know that was hard. The people are coming after you. You've always supported teachers, and you believe it's a noble profession. And so for anybody to be in public office and not support teachers, I wanted to give you a chance to just kind of speak to that, because I know that a lot of that wasn't fair.
Well, I do think teaching is a very high profession. It's a calling. People do, there's teachers in my family. Like I said, I'm married to teachers. I certainly understand that our teachers are an incredibly important, and especially through COVID, what they went through, what they had to endure, the way they had to adapt, the way they had to engage. If people didn't appreciate teachers before, and I did, but if you didn't, you certainly came to appreciate the job that they did through the pandemic. You're right. I was sitting in an event where someone made comments that I was asked a lot about those comments. And I don't generally make it my responsibility to talk about what other people say. A lot of people say a lot of things. Right. And as I said to people after that, you should listen to my words if you want to know what I think. And if you want to know what someone else thinks, then you should ask them and judge their comments on their own words. I've always said that our teachers were important, and I have supported them and continue to do so to this day.
What's been the most surprising thing to you since becoming governor? Meaning, what's the thing that you would say, I had no idea, maybe you've talked to Haslam or Bredesen about it, but that you just never saw on your radar? And I mean, it could be a good surprise, bad surprise, that now that you've served as the governor, you can say this is something that really caught me off guard, or something that I wasn't really quite prepared for.
Oh, I certainly didn't know what the job would be like at all. I mean, if you've never been in politics, and I never really had been in politics, I'd never been very political. I had no idea how political this job was. I had no idea how political decisions are, how political some decisions are made. Not just how some people make decisions entirely based on politics. It's a very political job, and I find myself, I'm a politician, I guess, because I'm in this role. But I don't think of myself as highly political, and others might. The challenge that people face in my position is you have a conviction or a belief, you believe something strongly, you move on something, you act on something, and it is political because you're a politician, when it might just actually be a conviction or a strong belief that you have about the things we've just gotten through talking about, impacting people's lives for good. I don't know about surprised, but just had no idea how political this job was. And I'll tell you the other thing that's been a little bit surprising to me is And I say this, and it might, don't misinterpret this, but honestly, the lack of civility was a bit of a surprise, especially among people who are people of faith. Mm-hmm. That's been a big disappointment to me. It's convicting to me because it makes me think about, do I operate that way? And because I am a person of faith, I do not mind saying that. It does make me think about whether or not I am doing that. And I try really hard not to, but it's been a little bit disappointing to me. And I talked a little bit about that earlier, just the lack of evidence of the fruits of the Spirit among people who are in political power or in political positions that espouse their faith.
The last question that I have is just how would you say you have grown or changed since when you were sworn in as governor to now? I know you've grown. I think Abraham Lincoln once said that the presidency drives you to your knees. I think any governor would say that running a state would drive you to your knees. But how have you grown personally from being in this office?
Well, it is the highest honor I've ever had. I say that a lot, but it's true. Like, Governor Haslam said this to me, and he said, don't ever forget when you walk up the steps of that Capitol that it's a rare opportunity that you have to serve people. And there are days when that feels like a burden walking up those steps, but I don't ever want to forget the fact that it is a great opportunity and a great responsibility, but it's also just a great honor to be able to do it and to be able to serve. And there's so many people who don't, who think you're whatever. In this not so civil world, the criticisms and the folks who lash out and who think you're a bad person. If you know in your heart why you're doing something and you believe in the reasons that you're doing it, and you genuinely are trying to serve people and to make life better for every Tennessean, which I've said that's the reason I want to do this job, then I never want to forget that. It's an
honor,
even
when it's exhausting.
It truly is. It truly is an honor to be able to do it, and it is exhausting, and it is, there are certainly days when it's a huge challenge, but it's an honor.
I want to go open it up for a couple of questions from the floor. So Jay, you've got some that have given to you. So Jay Hutchins, our executive minister.
Already walked in and have two questions here.
Right.
This comes back to the subject of public schools. And this questioner says, can you help us better understand your views on the separation of church and state, especially as that relates to the topic of public schools? And as you answer that, I'm going to collect some more questions from anyone if you'll hold yours up in the air, and I'll get it from you.
Yeah, so I think I'd probably like to know a little bit more about that question, but I mean, there are laws in our state that our public school systems are secular schools, and now people, in the same way that public servants, for example, who are people of faith, aren't going to separate you can't separate who you are, your faith, from who you are. Neither could someone that works in the public school system. Mm-hmm. But we don't have in our public school system, they're secular schools, and they've remained that way. I'm not sure what the question is about. I think there's an appropriate separation there. I think it's legal. I think it's as should be in the law. And
I'm sure that maybe the question is you've been an advocate for education savings vouchers. I'm guessing, I don't know who asked it, and maybe the question is, can you if you use that money to then go to an independent school, like
Yeah.
a lot of people do
Okay.
already? Maybe that's more along the lines, or maybe they're talking about prayer in schools and free exercise of religion.
Yeah, I mean, religious liberty is very important, and people need to be able to exercise their religious liberties personally in whatever avenue they're in. And we've seen a lot of that play out in schools across the country. That itself is a challenging, that's a challenge for people to sort through, because we absolutely should protect the ability for every individual to exercise their own religious beliefs and their freedom there, as defined in the First Amendment. And with regard to education savings accounts, taxpayers put money into the system for public schools, and if that money is used by that taxpayer to educate their children in the school of their choice, then in my view, that's an appropriate use of their money. We have to remember, and I have to remember this too all the time, one of the most important things about being a governor is constructing a budget and being a fiscal steward of the dollars that the state has and how we spend those dollars. It is not the state's dollars. That is not the government's money. It's your money. We have no money at the state government except that we get taxpayer dollars, either from the federal government, who gets their money from taxpayers, or from the state dollars, who gets their money from taxpayers. Remembering that the dollars are not the government or the system, whether it's to a public school or to an independent school, those dollars will educate that child. And if that child leaves that public school system, then the public school is not educating the kid. And that's the basis. That's the idea behind that. And by the way, it's happening in states across the country. Mm-hmm. We're not the only state doing that.
Yeah.
This next question comes from someone who has heard you say in several speeches or talk about American exceptionalism. And would you elaborate on what you mean when you use that phrase?
I think America is the most exceptional country in the world. I think that we have a system as flawed as it is. It is the best form of governance of any country in the world, in my view. The founders were remarkable in the way they thought through how a government of the people should and could work. It was an experiment of sorts that has created, arguably, and in my opinion, the greatest nation in the world. That has been, for a number of reasons, the contributions that it has made to the world, but also the way it has allowed its citizenry to determine who its leaders are. We have an election every 4 years. And if the people don't like the direction of the country, then they change it. If they don't like the direction of the state, they can change it. If they don't like the direction of their city, they can make that change. If you disagree with the government, you can speak out against it and you won't be condemned look across the world at the countries in which people cannot speak out. We're seeing examples of it all across the world right now. People in prison for speaking out against the actions of their government. That doesn't happen in this country. And, I could list off any number of reasons why America is the most exceptional nation in the world, and that's what I mean by American exceptionalism. And I think we ought to teach our children that. Tennessee is one of the top 5 states in the country, according to the Fordham Institute, for civics education. And really understanding, people understanding and children understanding that civic engagement, regardless of what their political views are, their engagement is what makes this government work. And when I see kids that do a class tour at the Capitol, I say, I hope you never stop coming back to the Capitol. Because when the people in the Capitol quit hearing from you, or if you're not voting and you're not exercising your right to be represented, then this country won't be the most exceptional in the world.
So in that light, what concerns for the America that your children and grandchildren will inherit? You can say that America is an exceptional nation and it's got so many great things, but every leader knows that there are dangers out there. It's not our democracy, it's a republic if you can keep it. What are the things that concern you looking forward about how can America continue to be the country that it's been all these years?
I tend to think I'm pretty optimistic about this country. I think that Americans are pretty smart as a people. I think that they have, for these hundreds of years now, country, and the fact that I'm not one who thinks that we are going off a cliff. I think that we recognize dangers when we see them, and we appropriately make adjustments, and we've done that for a long time.
Let's do maybe one or two more of the questions.
The next question to ask about the scourge of school shootings that we've heard about in the news. And what are some of your ideas for decreasing the school shootings, and how is the state being proactive to work with school systems to decrease that?
So I actually issued an executive order this summer that started that process, and I think we'll see that happen when the legislative session jumps back in, where we improve the safety of our kids. It is horrific to even imagine being a parent of that school in Texas or any number of school shootings that have occurred across the country. That is a really tragic and sad situation that we should do what we can to stop it. So this executive order actually starts a process. And there are a number of things that are going to come out of that. Number one, we started this SafeTN app that we now have, I think, 10,000 parents and students on it. We're putting it up in every public school system so that there's an app that people can report suspicious activity. We have partnered law enforcement with school districts. We are creating a parent engagement guide that will be available this fall for parents to understand what's happening in their schools. We have 100% of our school systems since that order in the summer have provided a security assessment of their schools. We are doing simple things like making sure that the protocols for locked doors are in place. This will be an ongoing effort to create a safer environment for our children and for our schools. It's going to require school districts, parents, law enforcement, the community. And there's a very important component of mental health that plays into this whole subject. So we have created a mental health liaison for every county. This is a youth mental health liaison for every county to make sure that we have resources in schools for children that are dealing with mental health issues that oftentimes are a part of the problem. We created, mental health and mental health challenges in our country are enormous. Mm-hmm. And
especially post-pandemic.
And including children. So we created a mental health trust fund. We put $250 million in this mental health trust fund. It is established, and it's established entirely to create services for youth for mental health supports. And we will continue to build upon that because it continues to be one of the one of the greatest challenges that we face right now.
Mayor Cooper was here a few weeks back, and he was talking about homelessness in Nashville, and there's a huge mental health component to how we address that issue. And churches are helping, but it's not simple.
We have expanded mobile mental health clinics across the state. We have put more funding every year into our mental health, what we call the mental health safety net. That's for those who are uninsured or underinsured that need access to mental health resources. Same with the healthcare safety net. So making sure that our teachers and our kids go to school and come home safely is incredibly important. I'm mindful of my former job in the construction industry. It's an inherently very dangerous industry. And, you know, decades ago, people lost their sight and their fingers and their lives on construction jobs all across this country. And it still happens. But what happened was that industry decided that they would make zero accidents on job sites the priority. I mean, there has been an enormous change in the way companies approach safety on job sites. And I say that, I just have seen over my years of working in the construction industry, a dramatic change and a lack of tolerance for any unsafe workplace. We should and will have that same focus on our schools. We can, if we make it a focus and we implement on a continuous basis and not one executive order that asks for a few certain things and starts the ball rolling. This can never stop. And actually, we started this 2 years ago. We have doubled the number of school resource officers in our state in the last 2 years. So this is not something that just started this summer. We've been focused on this for a couple of years, but we are continuing to expand school safety.
I wish we could stay here all night and get to all the questions, but Jay, let's do one more from the ones that are turned in.
You mentioned homelessness, and so this question says government is in a unique position to problem solve strategically the issue of growing homelessness, and especially as that relates to rising housing costs. So as a person of faith, do you feel like an important first step in dealing with homelessness would be to decriminalize it? And then also, what ways do you believe government can be proactive in helping Tennessee homeless to find affordable housing?
I think the Tennessee Housing Development Agency is focused and working on and implementing and actually expanding affordable housing opportunities across our state. That's a very important step. It's not again, that's not something that we have, that hasn't been something that the Housing Development Agency they've been working on that for some time, but we are doubling efforts there as well. And homelessness is oftentimes an issue of putting together partners that can work on it. It is oftentimes much more of a localized issue. So the issue of homelessness is really different in Nashville than it is in another county just outside of Nashville or in rural communities. It exists everywhere, but it's certainly concentrated in places in our big cities. So partnering with those cities and our state agencies is really the way to do it. There's not an easy answer to that, as you know. And if the mayor were in here sitting and we've talked about this at length, there's not an easy answer to it. But partnering together, and let me say this too. I mentioned your engagement with a school. Lance Villio is sitting in the audience tonight. He's the head of our Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. So when I came into office, we established an Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives to serve as a liaison between nonprofits, the church, community organizations, and the services of government. Because government cannot and should not, doesn't have the capacity or the resources to solve some of the most complex and difficult issues that we face. Government can't do that. You learn pretty quickly how limited government is in its ability to solve some of the most complex issues that we have. But the people can solve those issues if they become engaged in them. If the church becomes engaged in the homeless issue in a significant way, if the church becomes engaged in issues of poverty, if the church becomes engaged in issues of reentry, for example, if you talk about criminal justice reform, one of the most important things that can happen to a man or woman coming out of prison is that they have a mentor and somebody to walk through the reentry process for them. Can you imagine sitting in prison for 20 years and then getting out and walking into a society that has profoundly changed since the day you walked out of that society and went into prison? To not have somebody to walk alongside you in that reentry process is, well, let me just say, to have someone to walk alongside you in that process makes all the difference in the ability for that person to successfully reenter. The state can't provide that kind of service, but the church can, communities can, nonprofits can, engaged citizens can, and the interaction with the community and complex issues like homelessness are the only real way that we will solve some of those greatest issues.
So you brought up Lance. I'm glad Lance is here. He's a member of your cabinet. The last thing I would say is what from your chair, Governor of Tennessee, what do you want people of faith to know? Woodmont members, others that are here, how else can we make a difference and engage? Because I think sometimes people feel like, well, I can't do what the state can do, and you're actually saying the opposite. So what do you want people of faith, Christians, and even others to know about what the difference we can make in this community and in this state?
So when I was mentoring men coming out of prison, and I use that as an example just because I had personal experience with that, but you know, the organization I was involved with was called Men of Valor, and its primary purpose is to provide a reentry process for men coming out. The state can't do that. We do have programming and we do have ways of doing it, but we don't have the manpower and the people to make that happen. Government entities, whether it's Metro or the state or anybody else, doesn't have the manpower to engage in the homeless issue in the way that it should entirely be engaged. And there are enormous nonprofits that are doing great work there. But those nonprofits require volunteers, and they require they require the engagement of the people to solve those issues. Youth, I mean, think about foster care and the adoption process. Foster care itself, an enormously difficult issue, but that is entirely solvable if the people engaged with those communities, with those kids that are in custody of the state. And we need the engagement of people. Lance is that liaison for our office. Reach out to our Office of Engagement and find out. But most importantly, just think through where your passion lies and how you can serve the people in your community. And frankly, as a church, how you can love your neighbor as yourself and serve them. The hands and feet of Christ are the church. And I do believe they have an enormous responsibility, not to just talk about what should be done or to tell others what needs to happen, but to engage and be a part of actually making that happen across our state. We have an unusual people in Tennessee. I really believe that. We are the volunteer state. We are people who tend to step up. I'm really proud. We sent 1,200 National Guardsmen to Florida today. That's we're the state that stepped up and did it. And we, as a people, can love our neighbors